Welcome on in, golf fans. It's your boy Gsluke here with our round 2 preview for the Mexico Open. Going to take a look at the golf course and what to expect Friday, as well as some analysis over for DFS and for props to give you an idea of what to expect out there for the second round. I'm looking forward to it after day one, which was pretty decent out there for our exposure. No huge bets in terms of first round leaders. Props were about 50-50, but you're in a decent position out there for our large field GPP lineups. We've got 3 more days to work with over there on props and maybe for some of those head-to-heads over on Hard Rock Bets. So stoked for it. Going to go over all the info that you need here. So first off, welcome on into the live stream. If you guys are filing on in, let's get ready to get right on after it. So going to be real to the point here. Going to start off with a look at the golf course, which today was playing pretty much like we expected out there for round 2, right? I should say out here in 2024, not for round 2. We'll talk about round 2 here in a second. But this year, of course, played at a different time of the year. It's a little bit earlier in the schedule, so we expected it to maybe play a little bit longer. And that's kind of what we got, right? The scoring average was actually a little bit worse than what we had for the weekend last year. And that was despite having pretty low winds early on. So I think that is the added length of the golf course coming in, right? Making some of the shots play longer. And in the afternoon wave, though, it got a little bit easier as the temperatures rose, giving guys a little bit more rollout in the fairways, and the ball was flying further, right, with the higher temperatures. Still only played about 0.57 under par. So we'll talk about the weather impact out there for Friday. Looks like a very similar type of situation. So I would expect to see the same kind of split, right? Maybe the afternoon playing marginally easier than what we're getting in the morning wave, but not anything like a full stroke difference, right? So just to go over to the weather, show you guys what we're talking about here. On Friday, you're talking about at most like 7-mile-an-hour sustained winds. So today they were calling for that same kind of thing. It looked like they got a little bit more significant out there towards like 2-3 p.m. local time. They're calling for the same kind of weather forecast. So I would probably expect to see, maybe an hour or two once again where the winds do kick up higher than what they're calling for here. But even with that today, the PM wave did play slightly easier than what you had in the morning. So I would count on that happening again, right? If the PM wave played easier, right, and they were in the slightly worst wind conditions, that tells you a whole lot about how the temperature impact did make an impact on scoring. And if we take a look at Friday, right, not just from the winds perspective, you'll see that it's about 67 degrees for the first 2, maybe 3 hours of play. And then in the afternoon towards midday, you see it get up closer to 76, even 80 degrees out there in the afternoon. So I think that's why you saw the slight difference in scoring. And if there's going to be an edge out there for Showdown or from the prop angle, it might be targeting some of your late starters in the morning, right? Perhaps some of that last half an hour or so of tee times where it's going to be warmed up a little bit, or I think some of your early starters in the afternoon. So we'll talk about some of the specifics when we go through our actual player pool, but it's not the end all be all, right? Today it was about a 0.3 shot difference. If we take a look at some of the ceiling rounds, we had guys like EVR, Valimaki go off out there in the PM wave. Same thing with MJ Daffy was a PM wave popper. But Del Solar, right? Guys like Lipsky, Norlander, Olison, you see Cameron Champ, right, who shot -5, were all morning wave golfers. So there was a pretty good mix of guys that were going off early and late that went out there and shot -5 or better. So just because you did see that little difference, don't make that your whole process, right? You shouldn't be only taking guys that are playing out there in the PM wave. I think where the weather is going to become a huge impact for DFS is more so for breaking those ties, right? If you've got a player in the 6K range that you're trying to choose between, and maybe one of them is going off early, right, when it's going to be like 60 degrees, and then one of them has an early tee time in the afternoon wave, then take the guy that's playing in the nuts conditions. So that would be my advice from the weather. Golf course wasn't set up that much differently than what I was expecting. So not much of a change when it comes to my modeling, right? We knew that driving distance might even be a little bit more important here in 2024. And that's like pretty much exactly what we got. So in terms of the golf course review, I don't think there's that much of note out here. Again, a lot of this was to be expected. Perhaps the only real curveball or thing that you should keep an eye on was the fact that the PM wave was actually a little bit easier compared to the morning. Let's hop over to DFS, talk through some game theory now. See, we got Carl down there in chat. What's going on? If you guys have any players you want a specific take on, feel free to go ahead and let me know down in chat. But other than that, we're just going to talk some strategy here, which for rounds 2 and 3 Showdown, is how you make it a profitable sport to bet, right? 4-round contest, 4-round sample size. You have a little bit more of a sample to iron out some variance. But when we have an 18-hole sample size with golf, rounds 2, especially round 3 showdown, where we don't have those placement points, is the best place to take a game theory approach. And by a game theory approach, let's say you're new to golf DFS or maybe just new to, showdown golf in general. I mean, fading almost all the chalk, right? If you're going to play anyone that's above, let's say 15% ownership for tomorrow, make it a 9 or a 10K player, right? Make it a Tony Finau who has an elite level course history, right? Don't be taking all of these guys that are 25% owned. So let's say you do like a Finau, or let's say you're really fancy playing a Nicolai Højgaard out there for round 2. Stop with one of them, right? If you're going to take one of these 25% owned players, stop with one up there in the 9 to 10K range. Don't make your lineup start with the Nicolai Højgaard. Don't go number 2 with the Thorbjørn Olesen as your second man in. And your third man in that sort of lineup, sure as shit should not be like a Cameron Champ, right? At like 20% ownership. When you're playing a game against other people, right? When you all have the same sort of players to choose from, everyone's going to hunker down on the same sort of players, right? And for rounds 2 and 3 showdown, there are a lot of people that'll play the top end of the board, right? The guys that have played well on days prior. And while there's a little bit of correlation from round to round, right? Guys, sustaining momentum from day to day, it isn't nearly as big an impact as what you're going to see people actually playing, right? So for example, let's say Nicolai Højgaard, right, is going to be popular because of how he played in round 1. I could certainly say that about Thorbjørn Olesen, right? He's only about 10% owned for your large field GPPs. I've got him at 21% out there for round 2. So now he's, quote unquote, twice as likely to succeed just because he had a good first round, right? So going into this golf tournament, no one was really thrilled to use Olesen, but just because he played well today, right, now he's going to be 21% owned. That's the edge out there for round 2 and 3 showdown, right? Is exploiting that psychological advantage that so many people think that they're getting, right? All these people out there playing the guys at the top end of the board think they're getting a player that's in quote unquote better form, but it's just an 18-hole sample, right? Golf is extremely variant. You'll have guys that shoot -8 one day and then +6 the next, going full Keegan, as some have called it out there in the DFS streets. It just happens far too often to ignore, right? And if all these guys are going to be twice, sometimes 3 times the ownership of what they were going into the week just because they played well on Thursday, well, then you want to fade them 9 out of 10 times, right? 10 out of 10 times if you're going to play like a true degen out there. But that's the edge out there for rounds 2 and 3 showdown. So up top, right, I mentioned Tony Finau, right? If there's somebody you're going to eat the chalk on, make it a guy up top that you just can't get away from. For me, that's a guy like Tony Finau because of his course history, also because of how he hit the ball in round 1. Wasn't that great with the putter, also wasn't horrible with the flat stick, but quietly got it around a few under par, right? Had a few mistakes, or else it could have been something like 4 or 5 under par for the day. And at $12,200, I think if he would have gone out there and shot something like 5, maybe 6 under par, I think most people were expecting for Tony Finau, he'd be like 45% owned, right? Because he is 12-2, right? That is an expensive price tag. Because he didn't absolutely break the slate for Thursday, we're getting him at 27.3%, which is high, right? Especially compared to some of your, 7, 8K players. But in comparison, right, when we look at it in perspective, compared to a few other guys up top, it's not so bad, right? What is he? 2.5% higher owned than what we have with the Højgaard. He's about 6% higher owned than Olesen. He's about 7% higher owned than what we have with Steven Jaeger. That feels appropriate, right? That feels about like what he should be, if not even higher owned, right, than some of those other guys around him. So it's all about perspective, right? It's all about relative ownership of a player versus some of the other guys around him. And I think up top, right, if you are going to take somebody that's a little bit inflated with the ownership, it's the place to do it, right? He's up there in the 10K range. In terms of pivots, I like a Keith Mitchell, right? So on the other end of that spectrum, right, a guy that's not getting a lot of ownership attention that hit the ball well would be a Keith Mitchell, right? Keith Mitchell was very solid with the irons today. I know that because I bet against him for his greens regulation. And even though he only ended up like even par at the end of his round, he hit 15 of his 18 greens, which typically if Keith Mitchell is hitting 15 of 18 greens regulation, he's shooting something like 6 or 7 under par. He just could not make a putt for his life. So on these past Palm greens has been okay in the past when we've had him on this surface. You can see he's about a neutral on the past Palm surface for his career. So not used to losing like 2.5 strokes putting. Whatever the case was for Keith Mitchell today, it was not pretty. So up top, right, I'll take a chance on a guy like Keith Mitchell that didn't play as well as some of his counterparts up here, but hit the ball just as well, right? So if we look at the shots gained tee to green of somebody like a Keith Mitchell and compare it to an Olesen or a Steven Jaeger, they're all in that same kind of ballpark in terms of how they're hitting it. It's just that these guys had the putter for day one. That's why they shot someone like 3 or 4 under par, whereas somebody like Keith Mitchell was about an even par performer. So I'll always take the chance on that guy regressing with the putter, right? Some of these guys like Olesen that really, putted well out there for Thursday are probably due for a little bit of putting regression back to the mean. Whereas somebody like Keith Mitchell, right, he putted well below their baseline. It's not like they're due to go out there and have a better performance. It's just that in general, we would expect them, right, to play better than they did for round one. So 9.9%, he's a perfect example, I should say, of the type of pivot that I'm looking for round two showdown. Another example would be a Mark Hubbard. Hubbard shot -2, so it's not like he had a horrible day. It's just that he's sandwiched around players that are really going to suck up ownership. An example would be a Jake Knapp, right, who had an exceptional round one, was pretty popular heading into the week as well. You have guys like Hisatune, even Michael Kim, that I think are going to draw some attention away. Matt McNeely, I've got at 14.2%. There's just a lot of names down here in the 8K range. So somebody like Mark Hubbard, who's playing pretty well, all accounts, is, I would say, probably the best player in this range, right? Just in terms of pure talent level, right? He's better than Wu. He's way better than Knapp, Hisatune, Kim, Fox, really every single other player in this range. And he's what? 7.6% owned, right? And he's not like he's playing horribly, right? He's our number 7 model ranked player. He shot -2, right? Better than the field average for round one. And I've got him at a reasonable ownership number. So it's these sort of plays that I think are the absolute nuts for showdown, because they're playing decently. They're still playing well, but because they're not -4, -5 already, they're not getting that 20-25% ownership, right? It's not like they're playing horribly, right? Both are right about even par, a little bit better, right, out there for Mark Hubbard, are the type of sleeper plays that I look for in showdown. Next up, we've got Alejandro Tosti at $7,800. He was +1 of the last check. I think he was still on his last hole, so might have gone up or down from that mark. But I like him at $7,800 for a lot of the same, right? He's 7.3%, right? He played well here last year, so has a decent course record around Vidanta Vallarta. $7,800. It has plenty of upside. The only real downside, I would say, is that he's an AM wave golfer, right? I slightly prefer, and it's just a slight little edge towards those PM wave golfers. But Toasty, right, at next to no ownership, I would much rather play than a Cameron Champ, right? So I decided to show, a little bit of a pivot of somebody that's going to be chalky like Cameron Champ, because sure, Champ might project slightly better than what we have Toasty at in terms of projected points, but it's not a big enough projection difference to warrant him being like 3 times higher owned, right? It might be like a point, maybe 1.5 difference between a Toasty and Cameron Champ. It just isn't worth it in my mind. So I'll always take the shot on somebody that's at least a similar type of player. To give you an idea, right, Champ and Toasty hit the ball an absolute mile. They're pretty decent iron players, particularly with the long irons, and neither one can putt or chip for their lives, right? So you have 2 players that are in a vacuum. Like if I just showed you their shots gained metrics for Cameron Champ and Alejandro Toasty, you would have next to no ability to actually tell them apart, pretty much no matter what sample I show you for the two. And if that's the case, why the hell do you play the one that's 19.6% owned, right? I mean, sure, he shot -5 day one. That doesn't mean that he's 3 times more likely to succeed. So I know we're going over the same concept here over and over again, but that's how you play round 2, 3 showdown, right? You make those pivots, and not every single time you're going to get it right, but when you are right, you're not sharing them with a fifth of the field, right, out there at a 20% owned Cameron Champ. Next up, we got Chris Goddard up $7,500. Another player that fits the golf course quite well. He's a PM wave tee time, only 5% owned. Kind of like a Mark Hubbard, right? Played well in round one, but didn't break the bank with his score, right? So that's why we don't have 10, 15% ownership on a Chris Goddard up. I'll make that pivot all day. Another PM wave tee time. JJ Spawn, $7,200. Guy didn't play that well round one, right? Had a little bit of a rough start to it. I don't worry about that, right? It's a one round sample size, right? 18 holes that we're playing with. You might wake up tomorrow and be the usual JJ Spawn, right? That's going out there and throwing some darts. So 3.1%, that's a spot that I'll take a shot on. Down here in the 7K range, we got Harry Hall, another guy who had an okay day, right? Got it a couple under par, but $7,000, PM Wave golfer, and only 3.6% owned, right? I would much rather play a Harry Hall, right, who had a decent day, right, and is only 3% owned, than a Vallarta who shot -7, right, but is twice the ownership, right? He's there at 7.6% ownership. I would much rather have Harry Hall, who, again, if you compare Harry Hall and Sami Vallarta, their shots gain metrics, a lot of the different results that they've had internationally, right? It's the same kind of track record, but Harry Hall's half the ownership, right? Like, so why are we playing the guy that's going to be 8% owned as opposed to the guy that's, in the better tee time wave, right? He's PM as opposed to the AM out there with Vallarta and is half the ownership. And yeah, that's the last play we're going to go over for a highlighted play, but that's pretty much the idea with my entire player pool. There's a lot of guys we didn't talk about here that I really like for round 2, but that's the idea, right? Play the ownership game, try and, at least take 5-6 of those chalky players up top and take them out of your player pool, right? So I think a good way to start on the slate like this isn't so much to go down and mark guys as a yes that you want to play. It's more so to find the chalk that you're going to avoid, right? In the case of me, right, it's obvious that a guy like Olesen would be a clear fade for round 2 showdown. Eric Van Rooyen after a nuclear round, right? That's probably a prime candidate for a fade. Jake Knapp at 18.1%. Love the flow, love the vibes out there with Knapp. He's steezy as hell, but $8,700, that's a prime fade spot, right? At 18.1%. 19.6% owned Cameron Champ, right? Or like obvious fade spots. I think a slate like this is often best started by finding the guys that you're just definitely not going to play, right? And then trying to figure out a few pieces that work around it. Maybe you do take a piece of chalk like Tony Finau, right? You decide, if at least if you're me, right? You decide like, okay, this is like the one piece of chalk that I'm really going to go out there and play. And then you try and find some of your pivots around it. So that would be my recommendation out there for Showdown. It's really a recipe that we've used for the last 3 years out here on the channel, and it's worked out quite nicely. In terms of ROI, our number 1 ROI slate is round 2 Showdown, right? So what we've got right here. Number 2 is round 3 Showdown, and it's not really a surprise given just it's super straightforward, right? All the slapdicks out there play the guys at the top end of the board. You fade the top end of the board, and you print cash for round 2 and 3 Showdown. So it's worked for quite some time. We're not going to change it up now and go ahead and ride that for a little bit of profit. Let's hop over to the lineup construction stage. We can go through some of your questions first, actually. Then I'll hop over to lineup construction. And then after that, we'll talk through some of our prop stuff. Let's see what we've got. Toasty, I like Toasty for sure. So probably answered your question there. Carl says with Ryan Fox, I think he's a great bounce back play, right? Didn't play horribly day one. Got it a little bit under par. He's $8,300. He's like 10% owned. Totally fine for Showdown, right? He's lower owned than McNeely. I think has the same kind of upside as a Maverick for round 2. So I think he's a pretty solid play. Need to learn a little bit more about DFS. Yeah, there's a little bit of a steep learning curve to it. You definitely got to figure out what you're doing with DFS before you go out there, full into the deep end with DFS, but it's a lot of fun. Smacked those fantasy scores you sent you today and hit a couple other fade slips. Absolutely. Good start to the weekend. Is Harry Hall sponsored by Dude Wipes? I have no idea. He's a big dude, but he's not like big like Harry Hall big. He's just like tall guy. So I don't know about that. What would be the strategy in single entries? Some chalk? You can go chalk if you want to, but I'd play it the same way. Pretty much everything I've said would apply for that. Bounce back for Suh? I think so. I don't have much exposure to him, so I'm not emotionally connected to that performance. I think he's just a good Showdown play. If you played him out there for your stuff and you're tilted about it, play him, right? Because that's usually when the guy goes off. Any Ryan Moore love? Yes, actually. I was hoping that people wouldn't mention it. I like Ryan Palmer actually a little bit more than Ryan Moore. So when you first said Ryan, I was like, oh, yeah, Ryan Palmer. He's one of my sleeper plays for tomorrow. I'm not as big on Ryan Moore, but you did remind me that Ryan Palmer at 1.4% is maybe worth a few looks. Hey, Luke, could you talk about which contest I like on DraftKings? I can. Sure, I'll bring it up for you. So let me bring up Safari, and we'll show you. So this isn't something I normally go through on stream because enter the kind of contest that you want to enter, right? So me going through the contests that I like is very personal, right? So I'll just say the contests that I usually enter for Showdown, especially for like rounds 2 and 3, is I'll enter a bunch of lineups into this $20, right? And I won't max enter it. I won't go out there and enter a full 150, but a lot of times I'll throw in like 30, 40 lineups into this big $20, which a lot of people talk shit about that. I've heard multiple touts in the space mention that these huge, $20, $5 GPPs are a quote unquote waste of money. They're a waste of money if you're playing them to win every single week, right? If you're entering this $20 GPP or this $5 GPP and thinking that you're going to win money every time you play it, you're sorely mistaken, right? The main reason for that too is how top heavy the prizes are, right? So if you're going to play in a contest like this, like I like playing in, right? This is my sort of contest. It's all about trying to finish in first place. It's why I'm so aggressive out there with my showdown strategies. It's why I'm so adamant about fading that chalk, because I don't care about finishing at 20th in this contest, right? I don't care about winning $400 on a $20 entry. I care about trying to win that 25 grand to first or that 10 grand for second, right? And if I win one of these prizes, right, one of those top 5 prizes, it's going to carry me for a solid 3-4 month sample size, right? So I play a little bit differently. I like the large field GPPs. Out there for Showdown, we don't really have a massive sample. There's not usually a lot of large field GPPs to enter. So I usually go with the $20. But if you're trying to just get a few lineups in, right, maybe you want to be a little bit more sustainable about it, right? You don't care about those big scores nearly as much. One thing I will say is that your pros tend to care about the big scores, right? Tend to care about the GPPs because you are playing against so many casuals in those contests. If you want to be more of a hobbyist about it, right, you're just playing this to have fun, which I would say is 99.99% of you out there, right? So don't feel like that's a jab, me saying that. Most of you are just playing this for fun, right? Let's be real about it. If that's the case, then single entries, right? Some of these like $100 single entries make sense. They've got a few of them up there, these long drives. A few other single entries like this $200, right? You got a few $200 single entries. You've got some 50s. You've got some smaller $12 single entries that you'll have posted for Showdown. That's what those contests are made for, right? If you're a hobbyist, if you're just out there, you'd be thrilled if you just made money out there from your DFS lineups, then enter some single entries, right? There's a contest for everyone out there. I think that some of the touts out there that claim that, the larger field GPPs are a waste of money, it's maybe because it's a waste of money for them. So I'm just going to leave it there. I'm not trying to talk shit about anyone. You know who you are if you're watching this and you know who I'm talking about. I think a lot of the people that don't like these contests are the ones that have never won one before, right? That don't take them down regularly, that have bad ROI in these large field contests. Just know what you're getting into, right? If you play in one of these contests with a bunch of rake and 25 or what in this case 20% of the prize pool to first place, just got to know what you're getting into, right? Before you go out there and try and do that sort of thing. Let's talk some lineup construction. Let me get some agua out there in my system, and let's get on after this. You were thinking Harry Higgs. He's the one with dude wipes? It is, yeah. He's not. You were talking shit about Harry Hall and his size. I was like, hell, if he's real unathletic, there's a lot of unathletic guys out there. And Harry Hall is not that big. What's going on, Oss the Boss? You're in perfect timing for props. What's going on, buddy? Oh, my apologies. I can't tell I'm still sick, which is annoying at this point. It's been like a week. So in terms of our lineup construction, right, round 2 and round 3 Showdown, it's real straightforward, right? It's kind of like our main slate stuff. As long as you're not taking a bunch of chalk, kind of just mix and match the players you're looking for, right? So as long as you're not taking a Tony Finau, your second man in isn't a super piece of chalk like an Eric Van Rooyen, right? If you started with these two, right, you're going to have to think about ownership for your last 4 spots. But even if you just started with one of them, let's say you went with Tony Finau, who of course is pretty chalky at the top end of the board, but your second man in was somebody like Davis Thompson, right? As opposed to, a 25% owned Eric Van Rooyen. Well, now you have a little bit more flexibility, right? Rather than having to force in like 4 pivots, well, now maybe you can take a little bit more chalk up here in the 8K range, right? Maybe you can take a Maverick McNeely. He's going to be closer to like 14, 15%. Down here in the 7K range, right, you've got to mix in a pivot at some point. So maybe you do go ahead and throw in like a McIntyre here. You go down to the 6K range, you find a pivot that you like. If you were to have started this, and let's go back and just throw EVR, right? What is he, $9,100 and like 25% owned? You started Finau, EVR, McNeely. I mean, you're going to have to take 2 like sub 3% owned players, for your last 2 spots. So that's what I try to avoid with a lot of my large field lineups. And because I do enter contests like this, big $20, right? I want a lot of leverage to the field, right? If I go out there and I pick a player pool that has the absolute nuts, I don't want to be competing for that first, second place prize with more people than I have to, right? So that's why even if I like Tony Finau on a slate like this, for my large field GPP lineups, he only brings so much upside because even if he hits, that's 30% of the field, right? That has him in one of their 6 spots. So I don't love the chalk out there for Showdown, especially because I play in the large field GPPs. But if I was in a single entry, right? Again, more of like the hobbyist, right? Playing smaller field stuff, it's not nearly as big a deal, right? Because 30% of 1,500 entries, right, it's 300 people, right? It's not 1,000 other entries that you're trying to beat, right? It's like 3-4 times less. So that's why your strategy can alter a little bit, right? Depending on the contest that you're entering. And a lot of times when you hear me talk about my player pool, it's always my GPP player pool, right? That's where a majority of my exposure is for my contests and just the type of lineups I like to build, right? I like to build lineups for ceiling performance, right? I like to build lineups trying to build for the nuts, as opposed to going out there and building like cash lineups, right? Where I'm just trying to go out there, bin cash, that kind of thing. Just doesn't get my juices going, right? It's not the kind of lineups that I like to build. I try to be more aggressive, think about what is possible for players rather than what they're doing on a 50-50 basis. Got super lucky on an underdog draft today. You had EVR, Olsen, Wallace, Knapp, Jaeger, and Eckroat. That's crazy. That is a crazy lineup. Heck of a lineup. So tip of the cap to you. That's sweet right there. Where'd you even go wrong, right? Like all of those guys played well, right? Eckroat, right, was probably one of your worst scores out there. I'd say Jaeger too was probably one of your lower scores, and they still put up a decent amount of fantasy points. So heck of a lineup, dude. I don't know what 6th place would have paid you, but I'm assuming pretty well out there in that sort of contest. So good stuff. Well, that's all I got for Showdown. So if you guys have any Showdown questions, let me know. If not, we're going to talk some props, which I'm assuming we have a board now. And I assumed wrong. Okay. No board over there on Underdog. Let's see if we have a Prize Picks board, which honestly, if Underdog doesn't have a board, we're not going to have one on Prize Picks yet. Prize Picks is always lagging behind. So we do have some Eurogolf stuff posted. Let's see. Did they post Eurogolf over here on Underdog? They did not. So if we're not going to have a board posted, unfortunately, right, can't do a lot of analysis there, but I can give you guys a little bit of a game plan. So one thing to note about the scoring averages, your birdie averages and whatnot, they are heavily skewed on a week like this. So if you're using this 0.45 under par scoring average, if you're even using the birdie average, which is right around 4 per round for a lot of your analysis, you're probably doing it wrong, because what you got to remember is that a site like Underdog, a site like Prize Picks, when they're posting their prop boards, is going to post the people that people want to bet on, right? And they're going to post the best players in the field for any given event. For elevated fields, right, that's just the top players in the world. For this event, it's not the same type of players that we're getting for an elevated field, but the talent gap difference between the top 20 players in this field compared to the average is a much larger gap at this event than what you have for an elevated field. And let me explain this, right, this way. At an elevated field, so like what we had last week, right, with that, big field, all the world's best playing, your average player in that field is like a top 35, 40 player on tour, right? They're guys that are going out there making cuts, potentially even tour winners, right, that are the average player in that field. The average player in this field is absolute dog shit. It's a guy that like doesn't even have his tour card, right? I mean, when you're literally going down to like the 72nd player, I think it'd be like 68th player in the field would be like the halfway mark. Those sort of players hardly even have status on the PGA Tour, right? Those sort of players are going up to like a Tony Finau at the top. We're going up against, your other top end players like a Hogard, a DJ. There's not a bunch of them, right? In this kind of field, that talent gap difference is like 5-6 times bigger than what you have for an elevated field. So if you're using these averages as like your projections for the top end players, you are not doing it right? These top end players in this field, especially like a Tony Finau, are at least like a stroke and a half, 2 strokes better per round, right? So his scoring average for tomorrow is probably like 2.5 under par, right? That's where I would expect to see him at the very least out there for a projection. Your birdie average, right? If it's 4 for the field, I don't know it off the top of my head. Out there for round 1, somebody like Tony Finau is going to gain a birdie, maybe even a whole birdie and a half to the field. So just know that in these weaker field events, the stats can get a little bit noisy. And if you rely on them too much, you can get into trouble because you're going to have all these ceiling, I guess what's the opposite of a ceiling performance? Basement performance out there with these that completely throw off the averages. I mean, look at this, right? Dietrich +7. Speaking of, I think I just called him an elite player in this field. Went out there and shot a fucking 78. Absolute horseshit. But look at this, like all these +5s for like the spawn, +4 for Matthias Schmid, all vastly impact that scoring average. And if you're going to be looking at these top end guys on like Underdog or Prize Picks when we get aboard, just note that the projections are going to be pretty significantly off. So unfortunately, I wanted to give you guys a little bit of a slip here. Doesn't look like we're going to be able to do that, but I do like some unders, right? Weather does look pretty decent out there for the next days of action. So you can use rounds one data, and I think it will be pretty useful, but just know that your top end players are going to be significantly better than what you have here for the field average. So that would be my 2 cents from the prop side. Of course, right, if you want all my exposure, check out the Patreon page. It'll be posted there as it always is. Let's see, any last second questions? $550. Good shit, my man. That's a good way to start the week off, right? Extra $500 in the pocket. Never hurt anybody. But that's all I've got for this live stream. Hopefully we can be like Asian and go out there and take home a few contests ourselves. In Asian, go out there, finish first this time around, right? Heck of a lineup. I think you can improve on it, though. You showed it out there for round one. Hopefully more of us here in the live chat can join you out there for Friday's action. But that's all I've got for this stream. Appreciate the support here on the channel as per usual. Go ahead, smash that like button if you haven't already. And go ahead, if you're watching this on replay, give me a comment on who your top play for round two showdown is. And if you're watching this live and you're still around right now, I guess let me know down in the comments who you think the number one smash play for round two showdown is. For me, if I had to pick one, it's Keith Mitchell. I bet against him today, and I learned my lesson betting against Killa Keith. Maybe the Cashmere works well over there in Mexico. Probably not, but guy was striping the absolute shit out of it. So I'll go Cashmere Keith. Let me know your thoughts down in the comments, and let's have ourselves a Friday.